So as teachers, I think we're often very concerned about our students' motivation, right? Because nothing can give us sort of less job satisfaction than a room full of bored students. And then conversely, when our students are really into it and really engaged and achieving their goals, that's
it gives
why
us
we're
a buzz,
teachers,
right? Yeah, we feed off of that energy from the students.
Yeah, so I think maybe first of all we could talk about, what are the students' motivations themselves? Like what are some of the reasons they might be learning English?
Yeah, and then I guess you have to think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, right? Because a lot of our teachers go on to teach young learners. For young learners, they might not have a lot of intrinsic motivation to learn English. They might be more extrinsically motivated. Maybe they want to go and study English abroad or study abroad, so they need to do IELTS, or maybe they need English to pass an exam, but maybe they don't have a great love of English. So I guess there are different motivating factors depending on the age group. For very young learners, they're probably just there because their parents have sent them to English class to develop English skills. And then for adults, maybe there are more intrinsic motivating factors. So I guess they would be motivated by travel or studying abroad even, or maybe they want to pursue a career where English would be necessary.
But then also I think learning itself is quite a motivating thing for many people, especially for young learners. I mean, young kids, they love to sort of, if not learn new things, but to be successful or to show off or to sort of overcome challenges. So I think it's important to think about why they're learning the language in the first place, but it's also important to think about what are some things that people find motivating in general, right? So
exactly.
I find overcoming challenges motivating. I find like talking about things I like motivating. These are engaging to me.
Definitely,
so
and it doesn't matter what
that.
And it doesn't matter what language you're doing it in, right? So I think for young learners, if they're talking about something they love, even if they're talking about it in English, they'll be more motivated to try to convey it using that different language.
So I think as observers, and then also sometimes as teachers, unfortunately, we might see that room full of stony faces and people looking a bit bored and disengaged. So what might be some reasons that that's happened? Why might students not be very motivated in the class?
Yeah, it could be a number of reasons, couldn't it? So maybe the materials are not very motivating. Maybe the teacher hasn't built up a rapport or a relationship with the learners. Maybe the students just, don't want to be there, or they're having a bad day. Maybe the teacher didn't set an appropriate context, or the learners didn't think that the content of the lesson was relevant to their lives. I think there are so many things. Maybe the teacher goes in and says, today we're going to be doing writing, or today we're going to be learning about grammar, and the students feel that these are not interesting things. So I think that's one thing that teachers really need to think about when they're going into their classroom, is getting the students' attention right from the beginning and getting them motivated right from the start by setting a relevant context, and not just going into the classroom and saying, today we're going to be writing poems, because probably you'll get a lot of sighs and disinterested looking faces.
And I think relevance is crucial there, right? So what is relevant to them? And it may be, again, relevant to their goals, but it could just be relevant to their interests, to what they like to talk about. And so, for example, the other day I taught a lesson, and the context was what you used to do in school, and they'd sort of set it around Mick Jagger and what Mick Jagger was like at school. And maybe that's appropriate, but maybe for your class of young learners, this sort of 70-year-old rock star is not so relevant to them, and that wouldn't be engaging.
Definitely. It reminds me when I was teaching in China, and I remember there was one teacher who was very frustrated because the students didn't know who David Bowie was or Bob Dylan.
Right.
So I think he prepared these lesson materials, and then he said to me, but I don't understand, why were they not engaged? I prepared this lesson about David Bowie, Bob Dylan. How can they not know who these people are?
Yeah.
And there's also the fact of it being culturally relevant as well. I mean, these stars that might be very popular 30 years ago in Western countries might not necessarily be popular with people in their 20s living in China.
Yes.
or even known.
And I think also we encourage people to set a context. That's very important. So often language by itself is quite abstract, right? Like, so why am I learning the present perfect? Or why am I learning some more phrasal verbs? But if we set up a context where it's a scenario that they're likely to be in, and they can understand, oh, this is why I use this is why I need to know this. And it provides a purpose for learning that grammar or that vocabulary or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So it's important to frame it in the right way. And rather than saying, today we're going to learn about the present perfect, maybe starting with a question like, have you ever been to France? And eliciting from them some experiences. Or if you're teaching functional language for giving advice, then you go into the classroom and you ask them for some advice about something. So you set it up like saying, oh, I really don't know where to travel to on my next holiday, or where is the best place to get dim sum in Hong Kong. So trying to make it relevant to the students' lives and actually engaging them in conversation initially, rather than saying, okay, today we're going to learn how to give advice.
Yes.
It doesn't sound quite as engaging.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, another really important factor for me is the difficulty level. I think students, obviously you get very bored if it's too easy. And then conversely, if it's too hard, you can feel anxious, you can get some stress.
Yeah.
So there is this theory of psychological theory called flow, where there is a sort of sweet spot where the difficulty is just right versus your own ability.
Yeah.
And actually, I think often that's maybe a little bit harder than a lot of lessons are. And often people get bored. I already know how to say this. I already know how to do this. And we need to push people a little bit more.
Exactly.
So paying attention to what students can already do and then trying to challenge them a bit more. Even just within the lesson, can you say that a bit faster? Can you make a longer sentence? Can you put those ideas together? Rather than just sort of accepting a sort of lower production there. So that can be motivating, that extra challenge.
I definitely see that a lot in classes that I observe. So the teachers underestimate the students' ability, and then they actually come out of the lesson and say, oh, I think it was too hard for the students, that's why they didn't talk a lot. Where actually sometimes it was that the students were a bit bored or a bit demotivated. And even though maybe they're not able to do things perfectly, I think we always feel motivated when we feel like we're learning something new, right? So even if maybe some of the language is a little bit above the level of the learners, that's actually a good thing. Whereas I feel for some beginner teachers, maybe they feel like it's been a successful class. If the students know every single piece of vocabulary that they've taught them and are able to use it successfully in the final task, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've learned anything, and the students might go away feeling like, well, I actually kind of knew all of that vocabulary already before the lesson.
Yes.
So actually just throwing in a few new things there and, actually correcting the learners and helping them to improve their sentences, make longer, more complex sentences. This actually gives the students a feeling of achievement, right? So they go away feeling like they've learned something and they've developed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's very motivating.
And also that feeling of achievement we can show them for our feedback. And I think not just praising people and saying, well done, very good, but being specific about what they did well. That's very motivating. That helps to sort of reinforce things, but also comparing with before. So, you said that much more fluently than you did last time, or
you said that really naturally.
Pronunciation of that is better than it was before, whatever it is. And so I think two things there. One is they feel motivated by having had that achievement, that change, but also we're showing them we're actually listening to them, we're actually caring about what they're doing.
Exactly.
And what they're doing matters as
well.
Yeah.
And a lot of teachers, they say to me, oh, I'm scared to correct the students. I'm worried that they will lose face or they will be embarrassed. But I think there's a way that you can correct students that is motivating. It reminds me of one time when I was having a Chinese class and the teacher corrected every single sentence. So there would always be something wrong with my tone in every sentence. But actually I was communicating and anybody would have been able to understand what I was saying based on the context. But she decided that she would keep correcting my pronunciation, and by the end of the lesson I was so demotivated and I just wanted to throw the book on the floor and leave and never study there again.
But that's quite extreme, and I think often the opposite happens, where there's almost no correction, or there's just a light touch here and there.
Yeah.
And that, I think, students, if you ask students, quite often they say they do want to be corrected a lot.
Yeah.
And I think we can always correct a little bit more. And if people do seem a little bit demotivated, we can always row back and go back again later. It's not like the end of the world if we...
It's a balance, isn't it? Because if you correct someone so much that they can't even get a sentence out, then of course they will be demotivated. But if you don't correct them at all, or you only correct very, very minor things or barely at all, then they will either feel that the teacher isn't really listening to them, or maybe they will feel like, actually, there's nothing wrong with what I'm saying. But most students, they really want to be corrected. They really want to improve.
Absolutely. So this idea of challenge and achievement, and a slightly harder challenge and more achievement, like it's like climbing a ladder, right? And I think the setting the more challenging tasks is part of it, and also the feedback is a big part of that as well.
Yeah.
What about in terms of, I mean, we sort of mentioned goals there, and students may have these large goals. For example, a couple of students I was teaching the other day, like their son has moved to Canada to study, and they would like to go and visit him, or even live there in the future. And this is quite a long-term goal, right, for them. So that can often seem very far away. So how can teachers help break that down into some maybe smaller, short-term goals?
Yeah, I think with those kind of longer term goals, maybe you can break it down into smaller bite-sized chunks. So get the learners to think about what kinds of things are you going to need to do when you move abroad, or when you go to visit your son who's studying abroad. So that can include things like traveling. Maybe you need to talk to people in immigration. You might need to do an immigration interview. If you're actually going to live abroad, you might even need to do some kind of citizenship test or something like that. So actually thinking about the smaller goals within that larger goal, and then making a list of things that you're going to need to be able to do in terms of communicative functions, and also in terms of practical everyday tasks.
Those can-do
as
statements
well.
can be very useful there, right? Oh, I can now order a coffee, or I can now do my immigration interview. Like that helps break everything down.
Exactly. I can now check in at the airport using English. And then I suppose if you were teaching that person one-on-one, you'd probably design a scheme of work that hits all of those different targets. But it can be a bit more difficult, right, if you're teaching that one person within a wider group of learners, because then you have to try to motivate everybody. And that's another question that teachers actually ask me. They say, well, I have 20 students, and these, teenagers sitting at the back don't seem motivated at all. Some of the students at the front are quite motivated. How do I deal with the different levels of motivation within one class, and maybe different students who have different priorities? Maybe some of them are going to study abroad, but some of them are not interested in studying abroad. Maybe they prefer to learn English so they can play online computer games or something. So how would you differentiate for those different motivations within one class? What would you say to teachers in that?
Well, I think first of all you need to understand what the differences are, and I think don't just assume because it looks like they're not very motivated that it's their lost cause, or they're just never going to be interested. And it may be that the one-size-fits-all approach, it's not going to work, right? So perhaps that person is demotivated because all you've ever really asked them to do, for example, is write small essays, or maybe stand up in front of the class and give a presentation. So we can differentiate in terms of what the product is. What is it that you actually want them to produce that shows that they've achieved those learning objectives? So maybe for some people that is to write a short essay. Maybe for some people it's to do a presentation. But maybe for others it is to just talk one-on-one with you, the teacher, in a safer setting, or I don't know, do it with a song, whatever. You could be creative here. But how is it that the task itself can be changed to motivate different people? And
differentiate, I guess, based on the outcome as well. So like you said, maybe you have a project, but they can choose the way that they approach the project. Like you said, maybe one group or one learner can make a short video. Maybe they don't like to stand up in front of the class and talk, but they're quite comfortable making a video and showing that to the class afterwards. Whereas another student might quite enjoy writing a blog and posting it on the school website or something.
And a nice way to sort of find out what to do is to ask them if we... if we publicise what the learning objectives are and we say it in ways that students can understand, you can always ask them, like, how are you going to show me, or how would you like to show me that you understand this? And obviously that works with slightly older school students, I mean, not with 4-year-olds. But, you, again, if you can't ask them directly, you would notice or try and observe their behaviour.
Yeah, I think sometimes teachers forget to ask the students as well, and that students can be autonomous in their own learning and can actually tell the teachers what they want to learn, what are their goals and objectives. I think sometimes the teacher goes into the classroom assuming that they have to be the providers of the knowledge and set all of the aims and objectives. But actually with
that can be a whole lesson, is sort of surveying the class and, you know, like, what activities do you like to do? Which skills do you feel weaker in, and so on. Like, this is really helpful. Exactly,
and that's something that you learn to do on the TESOL, right? In the learner profile assignment. So you practice asking a learner, what do you feel you're weak in? Are you weak in speaking or listening? And then you actually analyse their strengths and weaknesses yourself. And if you apply that to a whole class, you get a general idea of the class's interests and motivations, and maybe they might be quite different from your own. For example, when I was teaching a group of, I think they were P5, P6 students, so they're around 10 years old, they were interested in a particular computer game or a particular celebrity that I had no idea about. But if you just show an interest and maybe go away and do a little bit of background research yourself about this particular new computer game, then at least you can engage in conversations with your learners about topics and things that they're actually interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we talked about lots of different scenarios. I mean, what about if you're teaching a class that, you know, really doesn't want to be there, and they perhaps don't see English as important to them? You know, general sort of teenage vibes, right? They can't be bothered. It's, you know, how are you going to get anything out of them at all? And I think sometimes we don't want to lower our expectations of them. I don't think that's appropriate, but we may want to lower the expectations of how much motivation we can get sort of at a time, right? So instead of trying to make this big transformation from a sort of grumpy, silent, not communicative class to some amazing sort of land of learning, we might just go and take baby steps forward, right? And try and find what we can work with.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think having realistic expectations, because I've seen a lot of demotivated teachers who say, you know, my kids, my students are just not interested at all in learning English. Or maybe they're teaching a class where the students barely have any English at all to start with. And maybe there are just 1 or 2 students in the class who speak fairly good English, and then the rest, their English is almost non-existent. So also, if you have that difference in terms of the levels as well, that can also be difficult for the teacher. So I think you also need to have realistic expectations about what each student can achieve. So if you have these much lower level students in your classes who are very demotivated and they don't see any point in learning English, I think even if you can get them to engage just a little bit, that's already progress. And if you think about it, there are a lot of students in the UK, for example, who studied foreign languages at school, things like French and German, and they thought, am I ever going to use this? So they didn't see it as being relevant to their lives. And I think the same is it's the same here in Hong Kong, right? But actually here, at least the teacher can say to the students, well, English is all around you. And what do you think are the benefits of learning English? And get them to think about the future benefits, maybe for their career, for socializing, maybe for being able to understand, Hollywood movies or popular culture. So actually, if you start to bring some of that interesting popular culture into the classroom, that can be a lot more motivating than just trying to get through a textbook and trying to teach them grammatical structures or something. And once you get them interested in something, once you get that hook, then actually they're far more likely to be engaged in the lesson.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So that goes back to finding out more about them, to setting those contexts, to bringing in stuff that is relevant to their lives.
Yeah.
At least we're trying a little bit, and I think it's often like it's a bit of a code to crack sometimes, is what will motivate this class. So keep trying different things.
It could be an activity as well, couldn't
Yes.
it? Maybe they'd be more motivated by some kind of game or something if they're younger learners or even older learners.
Yep.
Maybe giving them incentives and rewards. Maybe there's a particular cartoon that they like watching in English. So if they manage to finish their textbook or worksheet, then they get to watch this cartoon on YouTube, and then you talk about it in English afterwards. I find actually things like shows and cartoons, sometimes people might think that they're lazy options, but actually they can also be really good language resources, right? And they can be motivating for the students to talk about. And then before you know it, you're having a full conversation with somebody about the characters in the cartoon when that student doesn't usually like to talk to you in English.
Yeah, good. So, yeah, motivation. I mean, there's never a one size fits all for anything, but I think especially not with motivation, right? We need to understand the students. We need to understand what their goals are, what they like doing.
Yeah, the personalities and even the dynamics between different members of the class as well.
So yeah, keep trying different things, right? You'll get something out of them, and you never know, it might be a transformation.
Exactly. Keep experimenting. Don't give up.